Okay, everybody, welcome back. We're starting our next class on Capuchin history. In the last class, we saw the persecution of the Capuchins by the Minister General Pisotti and what happened to him, and then the observance, basically having a general chapter and basically putting out some rules for every province having houses of recollection so that the observants would have no reason to leave them and join the Capuchins. And we saw how they failed to do this, which caused more observants to swell the ranks of the Capuchins. So right now we're going to cover the internal reorganization of the Capuchins and the crisis that they faced. And these are the years of 1534 to 1538 that we're going to be covering. Okay, so 1534 to 1538. We're going to see in these 4 years an internal reorganization of the friars themselves. And this will be key to their survival. See, the Capuchins weren't doing this haphazard type of thing, like this province does this section does this. They had a very well-formed interior organization, that came particularly through the governance of Bernardo de Asti, which we're going to see in a minute. Okay, Bernadine de Asti. So let's talk about Ludivico first. Ludivico's leadership. So Ludivico of Fossombrone is still in charge. But Ludovico wasn't always good for the reform. His desire to fill the reform made him receive many without discretion, guys who should not have entered. Now, maybe guys pulled the wool over his eyes. Certainly that happens quite a bit in religious life. But other guys he probably should not have received. And he gave the impression that he was an observant in revolt. What's the difference here? Well, being an observant in revolt means he's simply just revolting against what the observants were doing, as opposed to really trying to initiate anew again the charism, the ideal, the gift of St. Francis to the world and presenting it in the society which he was in. And so in his government, he only trusted himself in his government. And since his appointment as Commissioner General, he never consulted the definities. He never consulted them, never asked their opinion. He just went on whatever he wanted to do. And he never convoked a chapter and wouldn't even hear of one. And between 1529 and 1534, certainly there should have been chapters for all the brothers to gather together to elect, maybe re-elect him, maybe elect somebody else, to tweak the constitutions, to tweak the life a bit, and to create a better uniformity, since it went from 30 to quite a number now of friars. So the increased number, let me say this. We then went from 30 friars to 700 friars in those years. So you're talking 1529, 30 to 1534, 700. You had all these OFMs, all these conventuals joining the Capuchin reform, and now you have this large, massive body that had many questions of orders of discipline that needed to be dealt with. And so it was difficult for Ludivico of Fossombrone to do that without convoking a chapter, without consulting his definities. It was a fast growth. You know, there are many people who say that religious life never grew fast. It's always a slow pace. And history says otherwise. When you actually look at religious life, when it always begins with a fast growth. Very few orders have a slow growth. Actually, it's more contemporary for orders to grow slowly. In the history of religious life, religious orders grow quickly. And that's just the reality of religious life. And I dare anyone to prove otherwise when it came to the early foundations. Okay? All right, so Ludovico declared that the order's existence was his own work. It was his own work. The gratitude toward him and pressure from outside caused the friars not to appeal to the Pope. So they needed to do something, but they didn't want to appeal to the Pope because they were grateful to Ludovico for everything he had done. On the other hand, they also didn't want to give their enemies any more firepower. They didn't want to give their opponents an inch because they would take 10 miles. So the Capuchins had recourse to the conventual general. Remember, they were underneath the conventuals. So they had recourse to the conventual general, and who advised Ludovico to convoke the chapter. Now, Bernardino Kino, remember, he was the one who was, working for Pisotti and then joined the Capuchins as a renowned preacher. So Bernardine of Aquino appealed to Victoria of Colonna, who was a good friend of his, in order to have her convince Ludovico to call the general chapter. So we get the women involved again, right? We saw Catherine of Cibo and Victoria of Colonna, these two very powerful women who have had a lot to say in how the Capuchins have lived. Anybody who says that the Catholic Church doesn't give women power doesn't know Catherine of Cibo or Victoria of Colonna, or Maria Lorenza Longa for that matter. Okay, very powerful women in the life of the Franciscans. Without these three women particularly, the Capuchins would not exist. Okay, so it was thought that Aquino made this intercession with Victoria Colonna in order to take over the position of Minister General. And I think that might be more hindsight, because Aquino was, as I mentioned, a notorious character in the order. And so some say, well, the reason why he wanted the chapter because he wanted the power. Maybe, maybe not. It's possible, but maybe not. Again, Aquino was a celebrated preacher. He was looked upon with great favor among many. It's only in hindsight that they say these things after he did what he did, which we'll see in a couple of chapters here, a couple of classes. So Victoria Colonna had Ludovico taken by ruse to the fortress of Mariano as a means of convincing him. They treated him well and entertained him, but that didn't work. And so Victoria then had him imprisoned at the Rocca di Papa until he gave in and convoked the chapter. So Victoria was no one to mess with, right? So the first thing she does is, brings him to one of her castles. She treats him nice and tries to convince him. No, so she puts him in prison. And that convinced him. Little feminine persuasion. So Victoria herself didn't trust Ludovico's word. And so she went to Pope Paul III and had him order Ludovico to convoke the general chapter. So at first, the Pope rebuked her for imprisoning a priest, but then he gave in to her request. So she got her hand slapped for imprisoning a priest, but then the Pope saw to her concerns and took care of things. So, all right. So on November 1535, the general chapter was held at Rome in the convent of San Eufemia. Remember, this is the convent that the cardinal set the lamp at and said, be gone by the time this lamp is run out of oil, and they all took their breviaries and left. Well, they were allowed to come back. So they came back, and this is where they had, you could call it their second general chapter, but it's considered the first general chapter in 1535. And Ludovico opened the chapter, and he gave the history of the reform and how much he worked and suffered for it. And rightly so, because he did. He worked really hard and suffered a lot for the founding of the community. Okay, and he encouraged the pure observance of the rule. So he must have been a very good opening that he gave, the history, how much he suffered for it, and then, he gave that encouragement to really live the rule purely and to observe it faithfully. And then they held elections, and Ludovico was not elected to anything. Actually, Fra Bernadine of Asti, former observant, former provincial of Rome, was elected the vicar general. So he underneath the general of the conventuals. Ludovico wasn't even given a place among the definitors. And so he was so angry that he refused the customary obedience to Bernadine of Asti. And he threatened to make a great stir. He was so mad being deprived of the office of vicar general. He and a few followers left for San Tommaso's in Rome. So he stormed out. A lot of good that did, the power leads to pride, and that pride, if it can't surrender the power in humility, then that person should never have the power to begin with. Okay. So Bernardine of Asti, what did he do? What was his response? He continued the chapter. He didn't let it faze him. He knew business had to be taken care of. The reform was being attacked from the outside still. Inside, there's a little bit of disruption here with Ludivico of Fossombrone, and he needed to settle issues to take care of these 700 friars now on his shoulders. So he established a regular functioning government. That was key to the early days of the reform, to establish a regular functioning government of the vicar general and the definitors, guardians of the house as vicars, and so forth. Okay. They reconsidered the constitutions with a view to greater discipline, and they were revised. And the chapters would be held annually. Let me back up for a second here. So the the constitutions, this is like the first real constitutions that were not merely a response to the problems in the observance. The Capuchin constitutions written in 1535, which get their formal approval in 1536, are really the work of Bernadine of Asti. And so what he did, he was able to positively incarnate the charism of Francis, to put it into words in such a way that the friars understood not what they were doing, but why they were doing it. It's really a spiritual document that really helps the friars to live the rule. It's so different from the constitutions of Narbonne, so different from the constitutions of the observance or the conventuals. It was really a unique document. And I would say over the history of the church, they are the most unique and the most beautiful constitutions ever written. I know a canon lawyer who studies constitutions of religious life and so forth, and he will say that the Capuchin constitutions are the most beautiful that have ever been written. And these constitutions will remain in force until the late 1800s. And it's actually only in 1915, the new Code of Canon Law, where they get a major tweak, and then all the strength of them kind of begins weakening out. And then in 86, they basically got it all together. And in the newest ones of the Capuchin constitutions, you can find semblances of the old. If you know the old really, 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 really well, you can see it in the new, but they're pretty much gone. But these constitutions were essential for the survival of the Capuchins. Okay, so it also is declared at the chapter that the Vicar General, so Asti, was to hold the office for 3 years and no longer. So it was a 3-year appointment, and then he had to be either re-elected or someone else had to step in. With 700 friars, they divided the order into 9 provinces. And provincials were appointed as well as vicar provincials. So you see that regular governance of the order taking place. So there are 2 fundamental clauses put into the new constitutions. The first, the friars obey and be subject in all humility to the Pope, Father of all Christians, and to all other Catholic bishops. Remember when we did Franciscan history, we talked about how the Franciscans were always exempt from the local ordinaries, the local bishops, which was kind of contrary to the rule and testament of Francis. We see the Capuchins here stating that they will follow that precept of the rule and that they will be subject to the local ordinaries. And then on B, it's the second one, it says, we renounce forever all privileges and glosses which relaxing the rule, turn us aside from its pure observance. And we accept only the testament as the one living and authentic commentary on the rule. The declarations of the Sovereign Pontiffs, especially Nicholas III and Clement V, and the Most Holy Life teachings and example of a Seraphic Father Francis. Why was this important? This is extremely important. Because remember, in 1230, when Pope Gregory IX, formerly Cardinal Ugolino, wrote the first commentary on the rule, he said the friars did not have to obey the testament. What the Capuchins are saying here is that they will renounce any relaxation from the rule. So any document by any pope that relaxes the rule, they do not accept. They put aside all privileges, all glosses that turn aside from the pure observance. This is a firmness to say that we will not allow any relaxations whatsoever to the pure observance of the rule of St. Francis. And then they say we accept only the testament as the living and authentic commentary on the rule. So for them, the only commentary on the rule was the testament of Francis. So the Pope may have said that it's not obligatory to observe the testament. The Capuchins were saying it may not be obligatory, but we're going to oblige ourselves to obey it. And this is so unique in all the other reform movements, that they take the testament as the commentary on the rule, as St. Francis intended it to be, as the guide to live in a more Catholic manner, as St. Francis says in the testament, the rule. Okay? So they see that as the commentary and the gloss. And then they look at the 2 papal documents that support the rule, Exit and Exivi. Okay? And then, of course, they look to the teachings and the example of St. Francis himself. So when there is a question about how to live the life, how to live the rule, They look at the testament, they look at the two documents, exit and exivi, but most importantly, they look to St. Francis himself and his writings. Clear enough. They look to his example, his life. How did he live it? They're not looking to go see what's going to be most convenient, what's the best way to do it today. I mean, come on, we're in the 15th century now. It's been 300 years since St. Francis. Let's make some modification. They're like, no. Francis was clear. We follow his example, his teachings, his writings, the testament, and any papal document that actually leads to the living of the rule, not exempting from it. Okay? So 2 declarations were to safeguard the strict observance of the rule. And one was exivi, which forbids the friars to receive money. This was essential. The Capuchin friars set out to live the poverty of Francis. They were not going to accept money in any way, shape, or form. And they will hold that until the mid-1800s. Okay? Now, it was a fear. This was important because the Capuchins really what they did in writing those constitutions, approving those constitutions, putting the men into power that they put into power in service to the community as general and so forth, were all means by which the order would maintain its strength, its unity, its uniformity, as it would then persevere through the centuries. And I believe this is the key as to why the Capuchin reform lasted and the observant reform didn't. Or the other reform movements didn't persevere. The reform movements of St. Colette of Corbet that she made for the friars didn't persevere. The reforms of Peter of Alcantara didn't persevere. The observant reform didn't persevere. The Capuchin reform persevered primarily because of the constitutions and their firm resolve to live without exemption and without exceptions. Okay? Now, let's look at Ludivico of Fossombrone and his great stir that he was going to bring about. So, the new observant minister general is Vincenzo Lunello. So, they elected him to implement reforms ordered by the Pope. So, the general, Vincenzo, requested friars to come under the observance, live in communities governed by their own superiors, and retain the habit. Vincenzo visited the provinces of Naples and appealed to Ludovico de Reggio in Calabria and asked him to return. So Vincenzo offered him everything to come back under the observant general, and Ludovico refused. He realized that he was onto something good with the Capuchin reform. Vincenzo asked for Ludovico's conditions, and he wanted papal protection for complete, he wanted a papal bull of complete protection. If he was ever going to go back to the observance, he needed a papal bull of complete protection. So Vincenzo, after leaving Naples, persuaded the Emperor Charles V to write to Paul III, urging that the Capuchins do not increase in number, especially in Spain. So Vincenzo was trying to get them to come back, but then he's also trying to stop the growth of the Capuchins. Now, the Spanish reformers were disquieted, and the Minister General didn't want them transferring to the Capuchins. So you had all these reformers in Spain seeking to follow the Capuchins. We're talking about the reform of Peter of Alcantara eventually. So in December, Paul III gave Vincenzo 3 cardinals to hash it out. One of them was Quinones, right? Cardinal Quinones, you talked about Cardinal Quinones, who was first in favor of the Capuchins and turned against them. So the Caps were permitted to receive observant friars pending the outcome of this commission. And an injunction of the cardinals were to suppress the Capuchins. That was their injunction. That was their order. So this whole little commission idea was set up in order to crush the Capuchins. So Ludovico de Fossombrone used the situation to bring his complaints to the observant general. So Vincenzo was all too ready to make use of Ludovico. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, as the saying goes. And so you have Vincenzo on the outside preparing to spring upon the Capuchins, and then you got this little informant Ludovico over there who's all upset because he wasn't voted back in. His constitutions were changed that he wrote, and he's whispering to Vincenzo, and all of a sudden Vincenzo has now more firepower to go after the Capuchins. So the Capuchins defensive. Bernadine of Asti held the community stable while Victoria of Colonna marshaled the forces to the Capuchins' defense. Bernadine of Asti received from Paul III the directive to increase the commission of the cardinals by 3 who would be favorable to the Capuchins. So he balanced out this commission, right? So that was a smart move on his part, so that it wouldn't be all one-sided. He got 3 guys on his side on the commission, equaling out the fight. Ludivico of Fossombrone got the ears of some of the cardinals petitioning that the last chapter was invalid due to the lack of the Calabrian Capuchins being present. So Ludovico now, his whole motive basically is to undermine the 1534 elections and the 1534 general chapter so that he could get back into power. And so when he's going to Vincenzo, the Minister General of the Observance, his goal is to get in there and get him to declare the previous chapter invalid. Okay? And the reason he's giving is saying because the Calabrians, Il Giorgio's group, Ludovico de Reggio, were not present for it. And so therefore they had to hold the chapter again. Ludovico hoping he'd be elected. So in February, Victoria of Colonna warned the Pope through his secretary of Ludivico of Fossombrone's intent on ruining the reform. She did not trust Quinones or his little party of friends. Quinones carried a lot of weight because he was the cardinal protector of the order of former minister general. He was an observant friar. So she took her argumentation by letter to Paul III, a lengthy document as to why the Capuchins should not come under the observance. She indicated the observance, she indicted, the observance for remissing to reform themselves. The Capuchins have grown in number and discipline over the past few years, she argued. They have grown in fervor. Submitting the Capuchins to the observance will not end the scandal, she wrote. Until the observant reform themselves, it would be dangerous for the Capuchins to reform, she told the Pope, to return. She said, and this is a great, great, great quote here, something to be remembered. What Victoria says here is crucial to understanding reform. She said, the rule does not exist for the sake of enforcing obedience, but obedience exists for the sake of the rule, and that one may walk the way of God and observe the rule strictly and purely. Very powerful statement she makes there. The rule of Francis, does not exist for the sake of obedience. It doesn't exist just to give people power to order people around. Obedience exists for the sake of the rule, and that one may walk the way of God and observe the rule strictly and purely. In other words, the grace of obedience, the gift of obedience, is to assist the brothers to live the rule and to walk the way of God. The rule isn't given so that we can live in obedience and just be like slaves, so we can do what we're told. Obedience is given so that we can live the rule and walk the ways of God. And then she argued that the observants say that it's impossible to reform 30,000 friars. That's how many observants there were. The real objection of the observants is that they lost the esteem of the people and that they are getting less alms. So jealousy, envy, right? So she's saying that the real reason why the observant friars don't like the Capuchins and trying to bring them under all this stuff is because ultimately they're getting less alms. It comes down to the belly. Okay? And then finally she wrote, passing over to the Capuchins should be permitted, for St. Paul says, seek the better way of life. Like that argument? Seek the better way of life. So she's arguing from St. Paul's letters now that someone should be permitted to leave the observance and join the Capuchins because the Capuchins have a better way of life. So the emperor himself confronted the Pope on his letter, and the Pope retracted it. So, the Pope, basically the emperor got into it. The emperor got involved in defending the Capuchins. Okay? So there was a papal bull issued by Pope Paul III on April 29, 1535. It confirmed the election of Asti. It forbid anyone beside those under Bernadine of Asti to wear the Capuchin habit. He expressly transferred the bull Religis Only Zealous from Ludivico of Fossombrone and Raffaele of Fossombrone to Bernadine of Asti. So that original document of independence was now redirected towards Bernadine of Asti. And so the habit with the long pointer could only be worn by the Capuchins. And it confirmed the election of Asti. He also gave apostolic authority to the ordinances that were made a chapter. Now, Ludivico appealed to the chapter's validity. So one chapter decision claimed that the rule of the friars subjected them to the diocesan bishops regarding preaching and ministerial work. So Ludovico charged that this was against the papal bull of Pope Clement VII. He demanded a new chapter, all the friars to be represented, and he wanted the order reconstituted as an order of hermits according to the original petition. So it was really odd what Ludovico was doing. It was almost as if he was just reacting out of anger, almost trying to hurt the brothers for not electing him. So the Pope did side with him on the fact that everybody was not there and that they did need to rehold the chapter so that the Calabrians could be present. So, do we have time? Yes, we do. Okay, the General Chapter 1536, September 22nd. Cardinal de Cupis was placed as the delegate to call and preside over the General Chapter. This was done with the great influence of Victoria of Colonna. Cardinal de Cupis first ordered Ludivico of Fossombrone to leave so that they can continue in peace. So all of his hollering to have a general chapter and to be elected and so forth and wanting to redo everything ended with him being asked to leave the general chapter. Ludovico was permitted to stay for as long as a riot took for him to state his case, as long as it would be. So he stated his case. Let me just say this: he stated his case. As soon as he stated his case, he was gone. So the outcome of that chapter: Bernadine of Asti and the defendants were reelected. Ludovico threatened that if they accepted the new constitutions, he would take action. They would lay aside the activity ministry and preaching. This is Ludovico's foolishness here. That they should lay aside the active ministry and preaching, retire to hermitages, reject the conventual general, and go under the observant general. The chapter fathers, the friars were there, didn't even consider these as options. They're like, okay, thank you, Ludovico, you can go now. Okay. The chapter fathers didn't consider that proposal, and then they re-voted in the 1535 constitutions. Now, the 1535 constitutions are now known as the 1536 constitutions because they were approved on September 22nd, 1536, the final approval. Ludovico claimed that he would have nothing more to do with the order. He was ordered to submit to obedience or to surrender the habit. He chose to do neither and left hoping for another reform movement. Ludovico was eventually excommunicated by the Pope. 16 years later, the Minister General sent friars to Ludovico, inviting him to return, but he rejected their offer. For a brief period, he lived with the friars in Umbria. The Cardinal Protector ordered him to leave. Ludovico ended his life as a solitary hermit. Some say he rejoined the Camaldolese. So we see the sad ending for this man who started the order, that it just was a sad ending for him. Now, Matteo de Bascio. Remember, Matteo de Bascio was the one who lit this whole fire. We haven't heard from him since the second class. And yet here he is now at this chapter, 1536. He came to Rome for the chapter, and he learned that he must be under the jurisdiction of the Vicar General in order to wear the Capuchin habit. And Matteo was not living in community due to the permission granted him by the Pope so that he can go about preaching. So he was torn between the habit and preaching. And finally he chose to leave the order, go back to the observance, and be a wandering preacher. He did return to the observance and continued his work of preaching throughout the countryside. Matteo died in 1552. He died as a homeless friar in the house of a friend. Today he's buried with the observant friars in Venice. So really, in one sense, Raphael Fossombrone died very early on during the Reform days. Ludovico left in a rage, in a huff and a puff, and Matteo de Bascio went back to the observance. The men who initiated the reform didn't persevere with the reform. They didn't end with the reform. I'll say this for the friars, the Capuchins. They were good. They reached out to Ludovico. They tried to bring him back into the order. They sought him out. The true heart of St. Francis that really still saw him as a brother and wanted him to live with the friars and end his life with the friars. But in the end, he died probably with the Camaldolese as a lonely hermit. Such was the fate of the founders of the Capuchin reform. Now, the Capuchins later will boast that there's no saints among their first founders. No saints. And when they say they boast about it, it's because it was the work of God, St. Francis, and Our Lady. It wasn't any man who brought about the reform. but it was God, Our Lady, and St. Francis who brought it about. Okay? Next class, we'll pick up on the external attack, which is not over yet, and we'll talk a little bit about some other things that have gone on and some more and bitter struggles for the Capuchins. All right, so we'll see you at next class. May Almighty God bless you in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.